One is to believe that the notebook of the old asthmatic, the dark by the trade, had decided at the age of 50 that he had done enough. He had gone to bed and not gotten up since. His asthma, however, was better suited for standing position. The small private income that had carried him only to 75 years, which sat lightly on him. He could not stand at the sight of watch, and indeed had not a single one of his in his house. A watch, he would say, is expensive and stupid. He judged time, essentially meal times. Only once did it really matter to him, by the 2 saucepans in which were full of peas. When he woke up, he filled the other pea by pea in a single regular of absolution movement. When he found that the bearing through of the day measured saucepan by saucepan, every 15 pans, he said, "I need a snack." It's quite simple. In fact, if one was to believe his wife had given him a sign his vocation quite early in life. Nothing really interested him: the work, the friends, the cafes, the music, the women, or walks. He never felt home in town, except one day when he was obliged to go to Algeria for some family business, and had stopped at the closest station of Oran. Unable to carry on without adventure, he returned home by the first train. When Turu expressed his astonishment at the curious existence that he had led, he explained more or less that the first half of a man's life was an ascent and the other half was descent. And the descent man's day no longer belonged to him, that it could be taken away from him at any moment, and consequently there was nothing he could do that was best thing for the fact to do nothing. Besides that, he was afraid of consideration, because he told Turu shortly after that God certainly did not exist, since if he did, there would be no need for priests. But from a few remarks that followed, Turu realized that this philosophy was closely connected with the irritation and the frequent collection of money in his path. And the things that complete the old man's portrait of desire, apparently profound, and several times repeated in front of Turu. He hoped to live to a great age. Is he a saint? Turu asked himself, and he answered yes, if sanctity is to set a habit. At the same time, Turu began to quite a minute description of the day in the plague-ridden town, so given an accurate idea of our fellow citizens' lives, and spent their times during the summer. No one laughs except drunks, Turu wrote, and they laugh too much. Then he stayed in his description. In the early hours, the light breeze blowed through the town, which is still empty. At the time between the last to die at night and the first to die in the day, it seems as though the plague relaxes in effort for a moment and pause for breath. All the shops are shut, but some of them the sign closed because the plague shows that they will be opening with the rest. The usual times. Newspaper sellers, still asleep, are not shouting the news, but sit on their backs of the walls in the streets' corners. They offer their wares in the street lamps and gesture of the sleepwalkers. Soon, woken by the first trams that will spread across the whole town, holding out the arms to strike the sheets from which the words plague leaps out. Will there be autumn of plague? Professor B answers no. 124 dead, the total of the 94th day of the plague. Despite the paper shortages, which are becoming more and more severe, forcing certain periodicals to cut down the numbers of the pages, the new paper has been launched, The Courtier of the Epidemic, aimed to informing the fellow citizens of the spirit of the total objectivity and the advances and declines of the illness, to provide them with the most authoritative accounts of the future in the epidemic, which led to support the columns and those, well known or otherwise, who may be able to fight the pestilence and sustain the moral of inhabitants, and pass the directive from authorities to the short, and bring together all the well-intentioned personas and undertake the effective struggle against the scourge and the fallen upon us. The reality of the paper soon confronted itself by the publishing advertisements for new products which were infruitable in protecting against the plague. Around 6 in the morning, all these newspapers started to be sold in queue forms in doors of shops and other hours before opening them to panic in trams and advertising the outlying districts Trams became the only means of transport. They hardly moved, and the footboard of the rails loaded with breaking points. Odd things, however, all the passengers, as far as possible, turned their backs to one another to avoid infection. At stops, the tram unloaded the cargo, and men and women all hurried to get away, to be on their own. Rows often break due to purely bad tempers, and becoming chronic. After the first trams had gone up, and the town wakes bit by bit, and the first tavern's door opens, and the counters lit in with notices, no more coffee, bring your own sugar, etc. The shops open and the streets fill. At the same time, the lights increase and the heat gradually builds up to the leaden weight of the July sky. This was a time when those who had nothing to do but venture back into the boulevards. Most of them seemed to resolve to ward of the plague, but the obstetrician displayed the wealth. Every day, around 11 o'clock, the majority threw fairs, the parades of young men and women among whom can sense the passion of life and flourish to the midst of the great disease. The epidemic so were bound to the morality. We shall see the mutilation and salived beside the tombs. At noon, the restaurants filled with twinkling eyes. Small groups of people whom have not managed to find the seat rapidly form in the doors. Skies started to loosen the illumination because of the expensive heat. Candidates of food waited to be turned into the shade of the Great Awakening. The edge of the streets burst with sunshine. Reason why the restaurants were packed out is that for many people simply problems of getting food. But to leave unaltered their anxieties about infection, diners spent several minutes planting, wiping the knives and forks. Not long ago, the restaurants would announce, "Here the cutlery has been boiled." But bit by bit, they gave up advertising of any sort because the customers were obligated to come. Moreover, the customers were happy to spend fine wines, allegedly fine ones, and most expensively supplements, and the menu snapped up in the frantic rush. It also seemed to be sense of panic broke out in the restaurant because customers felt unwell. But Pale staggered to his feet and rushed out the door. Around 2 o'clock, the town gradually empties, and this is the moment when silence dust of the sun plague meets the streets. The heat pours resentfully all over the great gray houses, and those long hours of imprisonment, which in blazing evenings baking over the populous chatting city. During the first days of the hot weather, currently, no one knows why the evening was deserted, but now the first cool air brings the sense of relaxation, even hope. So everyone comes down the streets. They define each of their own talk, argue over the lust after one another. Town under the red July sky, filled with couples and noses drifted towards the breathless night. In vain every evening, the boulevard and cranky old men wearing felt hats, large ties, walk through the crowds, repeating endlessly, "God is great, come to him." And everyone is rushing the country towards something that they are aware of, but which seems to be more urgent than God. And in the beginning, when they thought that it was sickness like any other, religion had its place. But when they saw that it was serious, they remembered pleasure. So in the dusty, blazing dusk of all the anguish imprisoned in the faces during the day resolved itself in the sort of crazy excitement and uneasy freedom in flesh and the whole population. I too am like them. And yet death is nothing for a man like myself. It is an event that proves us right. It was Tarot who had asked Ryu for the talk of the mentioned in his notebook. On the evening when Ryu was expecting him, the doctor happened to looking at his mother, who was quietly sitting in a corner of the dining room in her chair. This was where she spent her days. When she had finished the household chores, with hands across her knees, she waited. Ryu was not even sure if she was waiting for. However, something had changed his mother's face when he appeared. For a moment, all the truncaty of the working life and imposed on seemed to lift, and she would replace into silence. The evening she looked out the window into the now deserted streets, and the street lighting had been reduced to 2/3. Here, and the very weak lights cast a glow in the shades of the town. Are you going to keep the lighting low and the plague over? Madame Ryu asked proudly. As long as it doesn't go until winter. That would be dire. Yes, said Ryu. His mother was looking at his forehead. He knew that the anxiety and overwork of the past few days had lined his face. You haven't had a good day then, said Madame Ryu. As much as usual. It meant that the serum had sent from Paris seemed to be less effective than the previous one. The death toll was rising. And there was still possibly the vaccination that prevented the serum, except the families are already affected by the disease in general, and consequently would have a reluctant inquiry quantities. Most of the swelling refused to let themselves be lanced, and those in the season that had come to find themselves hardened and testimony the victims of the previous days. 2 new forms of the epidemic appeared in the town. Here the plague was starting to affect the lungs, and some days the meeting between the harassed doctors and the confused prefect. The doctors had asked for a good agreement and new measures to prevent mouth-to-mouth infection, which was the preliminary plague. The usual no one knew anything. He looked at his mother, and fine chestnut eyes brought back years of tenderness in him. Are you afraid, Mother? At my age, I no longer fear anything much. And the days are very long, and I'm never here now. I don't mind waiting for you. I don't know what you will be coming, and when you aren't here, I think about what you're doing. Do you have any news? Yes, everything's all right, according to the latest telegram. But I know that she says that they'll stop worrying me. The doorbell rang, and the doctor smiled at his mother, who went to open it. The half-light landing, True looked at the great bear dressed in gray, where you told the visitor to sit down in front of his desk, while he remained standing behind his chair. They were spread by the only lamps in the room, the one at the desk. I know that I can talk quite openly with you, True said, without the preamble, where you nodded in the fortnight of the mouth, and will you not any of us here, you will be unable to cope. That's true, said Ryu. The health service is badly organized. I don't have enough stuff on time. Once again, Ryu agreed that this was true. I am told that the prefect is thinking about a sort of community service, under which fit men obligated to take part in the general rescue work. You are very well informed, but there is already a lot of public dissatisfaction, and the prefect is not sure to go ahead. Why not ask for volunteers? We did, and not many came forward. It's done, though, in the official channels rather than the half-heartedly. What we need is imagination. There never arise the challenge of disaster, and the cures of the dreams where the hardly cope with the held cold. And if we leave their own devices, they'll perish and will not rest of us. Quite likely, said Ryu. I must say through that the thoughts are using prisoners, and that I would call the heavy work. I'd rather it was done by free men. So would I. But why, after all? I hate the death of the planetary. Ryu looked at Teru. So, he said, so I have the plan organizing the voluntary health teams. Appoint me to take charge, and we will leave the authorities out of it. In any case, they are too busy to cope. I have friends all over the place, and they will form a corps, and actually I shall take part myself. Of course, Ryu said. As you can imagine, I am only too happy to accept. One needs help, especially in this job. And the response for the getting prefecture to accept the idea of any case, have they had no choice but then Ryu thought, but the work might be fatal, and you know that. I still have to warn you. Have you really thought about it? Teru looked at him with gray eyes. What do you think of Hanalu's sermon, Doctor? The question was naturally put to Ryu, replied to it naturally. I've spent too much of my life in hospitals to look at the idea of collective punishment. But, you know, Christians sometimes talk in that way, without really believing it. And they are better than they appear to be. And yet you think that Penelope does the plague has benefited to be open to people's eyes and force them to think. The doctor shook his head impatiently. Like every sickness of the world, but the truest ills of this, in the words of the true plague. As many serve to make their people great. However, when you see suffering and pain that it brings, you have a mad blinding of the cowards and resign yourself to the plague. Ryu had barely raised his voice, but Teru waved his hand as though he calmed him. He smiled. Yes, Ryu said, shrugging his shoulders, but you still haven't answered me. Have you thought about it? Teru sat back a little further in his chair and leaned forward so that his head was in the light. Do you believe in God, Doctor? Once again, the question was quite naturally by the time Ryu hesitated. No, but does that mean I'm the darkness trying to see the light? I stopped a long time ago, and there is thinking anything usual in that. Isn't that the thing that makes you different from Penelope? I think so. Penelope is a scholar. He has not seen enough people die, and that's why he speaks in the name of eternal truth. But the least of the contrary of the priest is the administration of the parishioner, and those who have heard the breath of the dying man think I do. And the world treats suffering and not trying to demonstrate the fine things of it. Ryu got up, and his face was in the shadow. Let's leave the matter, he said, since you do not wish to reply. Teru smiled, not moving in his chair. Can I answer you with a question? The doctor smiled in his turn. You look misery, he said. Carry on. Well then, Teru said, why are you yourself so dedicated when you do not believe in God? Perhaps your answer will help me with my own.